Hey everyone, I recently scored my highest rated USCF win ever in an over the board tournament, and I am so excited to share that game with you today. This was a highlight of an otherwise pretty tournament. Before this tournament, I'd only ever played, I believe, 2 players rated over 2000 USCF in my entire chess career. And in this tournament alone, 5 rounds, I played 3. So I played 1 master and 2 experts. This game was against one of the experts. I was really happy with the way the opening went and felt really confident going into the middle game. Looking back, fairly proud of how I converted it. I don't do a lot of just straight up game recaps on this channel, but this one felt like kind of a good milestone to share with all of you. So I hope you can learn something and hope you enjoy. So I have the white pieces. We start with d4, d6, bishop f4, of course. We have to go for the London system. G6, I was really happy to see that my opponent was planning this kind of King's Indian setup because I've got some pretty nice lines prepared against it, starting with knight c3. My opponent continued fianchettoing the bishop, bishop g7, e4, taking full control of the center. This knight is nicely placed to defend that pawn push in the center. Knight f6, queen d2, already looking at this kind of battery thing, coming over to trade off this dark squared bishop, which otherwise if we don't do that, Black's bishop is going to be very strong along this diagonal. Castles and long castles. So when you have a game where you're castling on opposite sides, it's often a question of who is faster with the attack. So, your opponent's going to be pushing pawns at your king, you're going to try and be pushing pawns at their king, and basically whoever gets there first is going to have the upper hand. And of course, this is very different from the kind of quiet structures that you normally expect with the London system, which is why I really like to switch it up with these kind of move orders, especially against these fianchetto lines. So now c6, my opponent's kind of revving up for starting the pawn storm over here on the queen side. I go immediately for the bishop trade with bishop h6, queen h5 for my opponent. The move order in this area of the game is a little bit funky, but this is a typical idea, opening up this dark square diagonal for the queen to come out, trying to just come over here and attack, eventually pushing the b pawn, trying to kick my knight away, for the defense of this pawn and also the defense of this pawn. Like, all of these ideas are pretty standard in this line. And I've been burned in the past when I don't defend myself properly before starting an attack. So I first of all wanted to defend my center pawn with the move f3. Looks kind of weird, but again, this is like pretty much standard stuff. Again, the move order is a little bit off. The engine will tell you it's not quite right, but we eventually get to this position. Okay, b5, I move my king over to protect my a pawn in the event of b4, which comes next. I move my knight, and now my king is defending this pawn, which the knight was previously covering. Bishop e6, just immediately trying to set up some kind of checkmating ideas over here. But of course, that's why we can reroute our knight to c1 and defend this weak square over on our queen side where the king is now safe. Now my opponent plays knight b d7, just trying to develop, and notice that my pieces are still kind of all on the back rank. But because I've studied this opening so much, I know that this doesn't really matter because my attack is just going to be a little bit faster if I start with pushing my h-pawn, opening up this h-file, and trying to get an attack down that side of the board. So now knight b6, just moving the knight a little closer into the attack on my queen side. And this is where my plan sort of starts to come into fruition. So I capture the bishop on g7, king captures, and then I'm sacrificing this h-pawn. It doesn't even show up as like a brilliant because it's just like obviously the best move, because if any of these pieces take, like, you're just going to be totally winning. This queen is coming in. Obviously if the queen takes, well, then the rook will just take it. But if the knight takes, I mean, there's even ideas of sacking the exchange on that h5 square. Either way, you're going to probably be at least kicking the knight out. Again, bringing that queen up and going for some kind of a checkmating plan very early in the game, at least to be winning some material back for that pawn. So my opponent, obviously strong player, wants nothing to do with opening up that h-file. I'm sure he never even considered taking that pawn. Brings the rook over to defend that h7 square. And now this was around this point, I think, was where I actually had to start thinking, because I was not sure. I'd looked at this kind of position before, even with the rook coming over here, and I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do because I didn't really want to trade and just like go down this line where my opponent would get this open file for his rook, where my pieces were suddenly the ones not developed. The open file doesn't really net me much if I don't have a rook there controlling it. So taking it to me was kind of out of the question. The problem was that pushing it, which was kind of my other option, was kind of closing up my attack. Like, my whole idea was to open up that h-file and get all of my pieces in there as quickly as possible. But pushing it was not really opening anything up. It was closing things down. But I did decide that that was going to be my best move, because after I played h6, my opponent's king is forced back, and now suddenly this rook is completely out of play. It has like nothing to do over there. It's as if my opponent has like uncastled his king. And so I need to act as quickly as possible to make sure that that rook stays out of play, that the king stays in the center, and that I'm able to use basically my material advantage, having the extra rook in the game, to be able to attack my opponent's king as fast as possible. So now I'm like, okay, let's start developing some pieces. So knight h4, we're just looking to bring our knight a little bit closer to the center, to one of these squares probably. I wasn't going to mind if my opponent wanted to trade off that light scored bishop. Giving up their bishop for my knight on the rim seems fine to me, because this bishop otherwise might become a problem aiming over at my king over here. So that trade was totally fine for me. My opponent didn't go for the trade though, instead bringing the knight to a4. And at this point, I honestly was a little bit concerned about ideas like knight c3 check, because, if I were to take, my queen is under attack from this pawn, and I can't capture it because this queen is also covering that pawn, so I'd have to move my queen, and then suddenly there's like ideas of either the rook or the queen coming in here, and then I'm getting checkmated, and oh, it was so scary. So I didn't actually want to do that. My other option, if the knight goes there, is to just move it, and then I lose my rook, and then I'm down in exchange. So I didn't want that to happen at all. Anything that was happening like on this square was also kind of a problem for me. So I basically needed to cover my b file. I needed to make sure that the a2 square was not going to be an issue. And so I decided to move my knight up to b3, attacking the queen. Again, kind of offering, like, if you want to trade your bishop for my knight, I'm totally fine with that. I will capture with one of these pawns, kick the knight back, and, we're all good. My pawns will stave off any pawn storms over here for the time being, while I can get my other pieces involved and try and go after the king. So my opponent moved the queen back out of dodge onto b6. I went knight f4, attacking this bishop. We're not attacking it, but kind of threatening to trade my knight off for that bishop. And my opponent started to continue the pawn storm with a5. Interestingly, this knight move is kind of blocking, or at least slowing down, the ideal pawn storm. Like if that knight wasn't there, this pawn push would be a lot scarier, but because the knight is there, it's going to take it a while to move out of the way. There's really no place for it to go at the moment, so I'm actually feeling pretty nice here. One interesting thing I've noticed about higher rated players that I have played is that they are much more willing to not make trades, especially of minor pieces. They're more willing to keep minor pieces on the board. And a lot of times I feel kind of like a caveman, just like, let's trade all our pieces and go into the end game, where obviously I know they're probably going to be better in the end game. But in this case, trading off my knight for his light scored bishop seemed like a good plan. Doubling these pawns, maybe they're, a little bit better to stave off any attacks like down these center files. Those doubled pawns are maybe keeping the king a little bit safer, but doubling the pawns in general seemed pretty good to me. And again, that bishop was just kind of a monster aiming down at that a2 square. So I was fine with that trade. And then this was the one move that even in the game, I was not entirely sure that it was a good one, but I couldn't really find much else. So in this position, I played bishop c4. And I knew that his next move, which was d5, was probably coming. I knew that I was going to trade and allow him to undouble his pawns, which is exactly what happened. And I knew I would have to move my bishop back. But because those pawns are now a little bit further up, they're giving more breathing room to this king, which in this case is going to be a problem. It's going to give me more opportunities to push my own pawns. The pawns that were, for example, the one on e6 that was previously kind of blocking things from potentially moving forward in the future is no longer there. Another thing is that I really wanted a pawn, one of black's pawns, to be sitting there on d5, because I didn't want this knight to ever move and, kind of renew this threat against c3. Because if you've got two knights there, then all of a sudden that sacrifice becomes like a major problem for me. So if I had a pawn there that was blocking that knight from ever going to that d5 square, that was going to be really good for me. And in the previous position, my other option that I was thinking here was to push e5. And of course, I rejected that because it's just allowing that knight to go to d5. So this bishop c4 move might not have been the best, you know, obviously undoubling your opponent's pawns is not usually a great idea, but to me it was kind of a provocative move, like forcing my opponent's pawns onto squares they didn't want to be on. My bishop is able to drop back, and like the position is still totally fine for me. I've still got ideas, like this king is still open, this rook is still out of the game, and suddenly the king is looking a lot more open than it was because those pawns have moved forward. So now my opponent is trying to get his knight out of there and, you know, continue storming on the queen side by pushing c5. I decided to just capture. My opponent captured with the knight, finally getting that knight off the rim, and I decided to just go down the line of trades. So now g4, I still want to kick that knight away because it's kind of the only thing that's protecting the king right now, at least on the f-file. My opponent brought the rook into the game, rook d8, and I went queen f4. That f4 square is getting some action this game. And of course my threat here is I just want to push g5. If my opponent does nothing and allows this, then the knight is pinned to the king, and I would be able to just capture the knight for free. My opponent doesn't want to allow this and instead wants to trade queens. And here's one thing I do know, is that when you are attacking, when you are the person who is attacking, you want to keep your attacking pieces on the board. So I did not want to trade queens here. As much as I said I'd be fine with going into an endgame or whatever, I want an endgame where my major pieces are still on the board. So that means I want to keep my queen around. So I went queen g5 and now e4. And I would say the one thing my opponent does have in this position that is a little scary is that he has these two central pawns, which are a little bit frightening if they get much further up, meaning if they are threatening to promote. But I do want to shut down any of my opponent's chances at this point, so I want to bring all of my pieces to the party again. This rook is off in the corner doing nothing, so I want to take advantage of the rook that I do have. So I brought my h rook into e1, just centralizing. My opponent went rook e8, just looking to continue to push this pawn and make, you know, a potential pass pawn a problem for me. And this is where I start using my bishop to the fullest extent on those light squares, bringing it out to b5, attacking that rook. The rook moves off that back rank. And now my general idea here was that I wanted to try and go after and win one of these central pawns. I was pretty sure that I could pile up enough pressure to make that happen if I were to double my rooks, so that's what I went for. I went rook e2. My opponent played king e7, just trying to finally free this rook to come into the party. Unfortunately, he cannot also double on this e-file because, again, my bishop's covering that square. It's covering all the important squares in his position. So I continued doubling up my rooks on that e-file, and now we have rook b8, attacking my bishop. I move the bishop back, and this is actually like a weirdly good place for that bishop because it's preventing these pawns from moving forward. It can always rock over here. If this pawn ever moves forward, like giving all these checks along that light square diagonal, like I'm very happy with my bishop position there. It is in no danger. That knight is the only piece that could really like have any chance of attacking it, and it's going to take forever to get over to that side of the board. So now e4, and now there's suddenly a lot of tension here, and this was a moment where I got a little bit scared because I was like, I think I'm winning, but I'm afraid that if I capture here, that he's going to capture with the knight, suddenly get the knight involved, you know, attacking my queen's going to have to move, and then suddenly this knight is on my half of the board. I'm not exactly sure like what all the tactics might be there once that knight moves, and you know, these rooks are all looking at each other. Like, could there be a thing where there's like a check here and he's like threatening back rank or something? Like, I wasn't exactly sure what was happening there. So I actually didn't want to allow this knight into the game. So I didn't capture the pawn. I just pushed forward with f4, and now d4, just continually advancing those passed pawns, or, you know, that passed pawn that hopefully I think he wants to be trading off here. But this does open up that light square diagonal against the king. And it also allows me to push forward with f5, and my attack is just a little bit faster. It's a little bit more pressing because it is targeting his king, you know, the squares around his king, rather than just pushing pawns. So after my opponent played rook e5, you know, trying to pin this pawn to my queen, I just captured on g6, and it doesn't matter that my queen's hanging because this pawn is checking the king. My opponent captured back with the h-pawn, and I love these kind of sequences where I can just like leave my queen hanging while I continue to kick my opponent's king around with checks. So I finally brought my bishop back to b3, giving the check on that diagonal. My opponent moved the knight in. I gave check on f2 with the rook. The king moves back still on that light square diagonal. So this knight is still pinned. So there's obviously, like, with the makeup of this position, there's just a ton of tactics at play. And now finally I move my queen out of dodge, and I'm I'm threatening as many things as I can over here. You know, all of the puzzle rush mates are kind of swimming through my head right now. And again, notice because the knight is pinned to the king, it cannot actually capture my queen. So I was really taking advantage of all the pins happening here. My opponent went queen e6, just preventing the check on f7. Also unpinning the knight. So if I were to do nothing in this situation, my opponent could capture the knight, and if I captured the queen, then they could capture back with the knight, and I would be down a piece. We're getting a little bit more into time trouble here, so at this point it's just kind of like trying to hold the advantage and make things happen. So didn't really want to deal with all the tactics that came with the minor pieces still being on the board, so I just captured the knight. My opponent captured back with the queen. And now finally my little h-pawn is able to make the sacrifice that he's been waiting to make all game, pushing forward with h7, the king takes, and now my h-file is finally opened up for the rook to come in with check. King moves back, and now queen f6 is kind of the nail in the coffin. There's no way to stop the checkmate by bringing the rook up to h8, other than some, quick spite checks. My opponent goes queen e6, and I'm checkmating in the corner with this nice little composition. So I was incredibly proud of this win. It really felt just like smooth as butter from the opening. I felt like I was able to just keep my advantage with a few minor hiccups throughout pretty much the entire way through the game, and it felt really good to get a win like this. But one more thing I will say is that a shout out to my opponent, because I know how it feels to be on the other side. It happened to me in this very tournament where you were the higher rated player and somebody, couple hundred points lower than you upsets you. And the key is to not actually get upset. And it's harder than it sounds, but my opponent and many others that I have faced in, the couple years I've been playing tournament chess, my opponent in this case was so incredibly gracious and, sat down with me after the game, did a quick postmortem, and was talking about some lines. Like, obviously, he's the higher rated player for a reason. I still consider him better at chess than me. I just got him this one time. And, his expertise is something that I'm willing to sit there and drink up because he's just got way more experience than me. So when he was showing me lines that I hadn't even considered, a way that I could have traded off into a better endgame and just some more thematic wins, I was really grateful for that. And I would encourage you, if you are ever in that position where you are the higher rated player who's getting upset, to, be able to take that as graciously as possible and still just recognize that we are just two players who are spending our weekends sitting at chessboards for hours and hours. And it's because this is a game that we both love. And to be able to just recognize that at a human level is something that I continually strive for, and I hope that I can share that experience with you as well. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed, got some instructional value out of this as well as some entertainment value. If you do want to see more game recaps like this, please do let me know in the comments, or let me know what other kind of content you want to see. I'm working on my content for the upcoming year in the next couple of weeks, so for sure let me know that. And otherwise, please be sure to subscribe. It does really help me out a lot, and I will see you soon.